Welcome to the next Bible study and Genesis, and picking up in Genesis 15 this week. You can listen to previous weeks, you'll find them on YouTube as well. And this week I'm going to carry on a little bit more with the life of Abraham. Originally I intended to do this just a quick overview over 3 weeks, but I think I've really got a bit stuck in here, and I'm enjoying some of the detail that comes out. We're hitting a very important moment here where God makes a very special covenant with Abraham and promise to him. So I'm going to pick this up. I'm going to read a little bit from Genesis 15, and then we'll just take a few thoughts out of this. It says, the word of the Lord came to Abraham in a vision. Do not be afraid, Abraham. I am your shield and your very great reward. But Abraham said, Sovereign Lord, what can you give me since I remain childless? And the one who inherits my estate is Eliezer of Damascus. And Abraham said, You have given me no children, so a servant in my household will be my heir. Then the word of the Lord came to him, This man will not be your heir, but a son who is your own flesh and blood will be your heir. He took him outside and said, Look up at the sky and count the stars, if indeed you can count them. Then he said, So shall your offspring be. Abraham believed the Lord, and it was credited to him as righteousness. So this is the beginning of this, really, when God's setting his purpose in a greater measure. He'd already promised Abraham a land, that he was heading to a land. But here is basically the start where God is beginning to lay out the plan of how this is going to happen. And Abraham doesn't really have a grid of reference for it. He's internally, he realizes, and he's getting on a bit, and he's decided, I'm not going to have any children. It's not going to work that way. But God speaks into that, and he promises him a great reward. And then he promises him that he will have a son. Now, this is just an amazing thing. When you actually read this passage, Abraham's response is key. And there's some stuff we can learn from that. But before we get to that, and you also find that God said to Abraham, lift your eyes, basically, and try and count the stars. Now, it's quite interesting, isn't it? Because Abraham, he'd been brought up in a culture and among people that worship the stars. They worship the moon gods. So he'd probably been very familiar with the stars. And they reckon in those days that they could probably have seen sort of 3,000 stars-ish, maybe four, with the naked eye. So Abraham could have looked and gone, actually, I probably could count the stars. It'd be a bit of a challenge, when you look up at the sky, trying to divide the sky up. But it wasn't an impossible sounding task. Interestingly, later on, when God speaks to him again and tells him to count the stars, he also points to the number of grains of sand, on the seashore and the desert, and says, count those as well. And so God brings in the magnificence of that statement in more detail later on. I find it amazing. It's like even here, God is prophesying beyond Abraham's ability to see. He's prophesying count the stars. But the missing bit is really, Abraham, you can't even see all the stars to count them. Nowadays, with modern telescopes and everything else, we're much more able to see beyond and count beyond. There's millions of stars. I read something that if you counted one star every 3 seconds for 100 years, you still have only counted 5% of the stars. Just incredible numbers. The other thing that would have been noticeable in Abraham's day, like today, there's a lot of light around, but he was probably quite used to going out into the dark. I don't know if you've ever done it in a really dark place, and then you can just look at the sky, and it's just incredible without that light pollution, seeing the brightness of the stars. So God was capturing Abraham's heart. He was drawing him in. But I love Abraham's response to God. He says this, it says, Abraham believed the Lord, and it was credited to him as righteousness. You see, when you look, what did Abraham have to do to be called righteous? It's actually very simple. He had to believe God. And this is setting up, I think, in the Old Testament, in Genesis, God is setting up the line that is so relevant to us. What do we have to do to come into relationship with God? Believe him. Believe what he says is true. Believe that Jesus died for us. Believe that Jesus rose again to life for us. That on the third day, he's resurrected to life and he's alive and he's seated in heavenly places, far above all rule and authority, power and dominion in this age and the age to come. Jesus is up there. Yeah, he's already established on the throne. To become a Christian, the steps actually aren't that complicated. It's believe God. And what you receive in response from God is credited to you as righteousness. So Abraham here is in a life-changing moment in his own walk with God, but life-changing as well in the promise that he has. There's a promise that isn't actually just about his natural descendants. But if you look elsewhere about Abraham, you realize that his descendants are us as well, that we're grafted in by faith when we believe. So you've got this incredible bit of story going on here. And yeah, I want to encourage you for a minute. If you get a bit of time, why not just go outside and count a few stars and grasp the enormity of the promise of God? If you've got a bit of time, realize that if you've got something that God's promised to you, that really, even if you can see the detail, there's a raft of detail that's beyond your vision that God wants to take you into. Yeah, I find that really exciting, that the promises of God are constantly expansive. And it's like we'll walk through into eternity still, carrying almost another dimension of promise. I don't think God's promises run out. I think our time runs out and we step into eternity. But I don't think his promises ever run out for us. So I just want to take us briefly onto the next bit. You see that Abraham then questions God and says, God says, I'm going to give you this land. And he says, well, how's that going to happen? How do I know? And God sets up a sacrifice with Abraham. And this is a covenant moment. It's literally a cutting of a covenant. And this is the moment that establishes for Abraham what has happened and what's going to happen. And he sets up this sacrifice. And in verse 11 of chapter 15, it says, the birds of prey came and down on the carcasses. Abraham drove them away. And I just want us to grab this little bit today. When we have those places with God, Satan, it says, he comes, he's prowling around looking to steal and destroy. Places that are important to you in your relationship with God, places you value in your relationship with God, those intimate places with him, I want to encourage you, protect them. See, Abraham didn't fall asleep, but he was waiting at the place of sacrifice. And for us, I'm so aware with the times that we live in, it's so easy to get despondent, disillusioned, disconnected, both from people and from God. Don't allow that to happen. Guard your place with him. Protect it. He's guarding it and you're joining in the guard. Don't allow Satan to get a foothold to bring damage and destruction. You see, for Abraham, this is the place of sacrifice. For Abraham, he'd set it all up and he waited and he guarded. When you go back to the garden, what did Adam and Eve fail to do? They failed to guard. They failed to guard themselves, and they ended up taking of the tree. They failed to trust God and to believe God and believe what God said, because when Satan, the serpent, spoke, they listened and doubted what God had said. And that was the beginning of the journey downhill, really, wasn't it? So they'd failed to believe God. And they were told to guard the garden, and they failed to guard the garden. Abraham here is reversing something. And he's demonstrating, is a shadow of what Jesus came to do. I love it, the fact that Jesus, he was arrested in a garden, wasn't he? And there's this imagery that goes through. It was in the Garden of Gethsemane that he shed the sweats of drops of blood, the sweat. We haven't got time to go into that, but there's comparisons there. So for us, guard your place with God. Don't let Satan in any way step in and destroy it. And very quickly, what happens here for Abraham, it's that moment. It says, as the sun was setting, he fell asleep. It says, a thick and dreadful darkness came over him. If you want another little study, it's like a number of times we think of God as being in light, but it talks about him being cloaked in darkness. Different study. But then God makes the promise with him and cuts the covenant with him. If you read to the end of the chapter, it says the sun had set and darkness had fallen. A smoking fire pot with a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abraham and said, to your descendants, I give this land. And then he goes on and names the land in the promise. God's got so many promises for us to walk into. We've walked into many, but there's many more to step into. Bless you. Have a good day and guard your place with him. Bye for now.